Hello, it's Shamrocker again. Welcome to the Proud Heretic channel, where today's topic is the faith that taught me to fear and mistrust myself. So, what happens when a faith system teaches you to distrust your mind, your heart, your conscience, your emotions, and your very human identity? Well, that question touches upon theology, psychology, identity, mental health, and spirituality all at one and the same time. Now, certain forms of evangelical or fear-based religion, as I know from personal experience, taught me to fear and mistrust myself. Now, a typical text that evangelicals go to try and prove this notion, and the same text that I used against myself plenty to condemn my own thoughts, desires, heart, and emotions, is found in Jeremiah 17, verse 9, where it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and who can know it?" Have you ever been told that your heart is deceitful, that your emotions can't be trusted, your thoughts might be a temptation that you need to be on guard for, or that your doubts are somehow dangerous, or your desires are corrupt, that maybe you can't love who you love? Or have you ever been told that your conscience is unreliable? Well, what happens when a person spends years, in my case, 47 years, hearing those kinds of messages? And what happens when the very tools that we use to navigate life every day, like our emotions, our intuition, our curiosity, our conscience, and critical thinking, become things we were taught to fear? Why? Why is that? Today, I want to talk about one of the deepest reasons why I began deconstructing my faith. So what about Jeremiah 17:9? Well, I don't think, upon further reflection, that Jeremiah 17:9 means what I was taught that it means. The verse says, again, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and who can know it?" Or another translation says, "Who can understand it?" So in other words, according to the Bible, we can't really understand ourselves. We can't trust ourselves. Anything that we think or desire, it immediately comes under suspicion, with the white hanging light right above you, as if you need to start interrogating yourself as to why that might be. The question here is, who was Jeremiah talking to? Well, Jeremiah was not writing a psychology book about human nature. He was speaking to a specific nation in crisis. He was criticizing Judah's idolatry. Jeremiah is describing people who have become disconnected from God and their own moral center. That's a very different thing than saying never trust any intuition, conscience, feeling, judgment, perception, experience, or inner wisdom that you ever had. Well, that's how many of us, including me, heard it growing up. Part one, God was always watching. Well, growing up, I often felt as if I were under constant surveillance, like God is the celestial big brother in the sky, okay? Not just loved, but I was being observed, evaluated, monitored. Every thought mattered. Every desire mattered. God wasn't merely present or omniscient. God was keeping score, man. It was a pre-scripted Truman Show. At least that's how it felt for me. Now, many people raised in highly scrupulous religious environments like I was describe developing what's called hypervigilance. And that's a real thing. It's a real psychological term. It's a real psychological disorder. So what is hypervigilance? Well, this is a constant awareness that someone is watching, a constant concern that you're getting something wrong, a constant need to monitor yourself, not because you're trying to become a better person, but because you're afraid. You're fearful of yourself. After all, Jesus holds the keys of death and Hades, does he not? Well, if Jesus is God, and if God is keeping score, then we damn sure better monitor ourselves, because he holds the keys. Part 2, original sin and distrusting humanity. Now, one of the most powerful messages that I absorbed growing up and even up until last year was, you are inherently sinful. You're not just flawed. You're not just corrupt. You're guilty. You're guilty as a baby. Now, in some theological systems, yes, even infants are described as guilty before they've done anything wrong. Now, that idea really goes back to Augustine and his horrible interpretations of Paul. And this idea shaped how I viewed humanity, myself, and others. And if my nature is fundamentally corrupt as I was taught, then how can I trust my instincts? How can I trust my compassion? How can I trust my empathy? How can I trust my judgment? You see, it was constant self-suspicion. It was suspicion drawn inward. If I can't trust myself whatsoever, how can I trust you or any other human on earth if we were all born guilty as babies? You see, this really pollutes one's worldview of humanity in general. This notion and this constant indoctrination led me to isolation. Why would I want to be around a corrupt, perverse world, you see? And after all, doesn't the Bible say, "Come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord"? I found, rather, that that's psychologically unhealthy. Part 3, fear of getting it wrong. I was told in some churches that salvation is all of grace and that you can't do anything to lose it. Yet, I always felt as if I could lose everything at any moment. One wrong belief, one wrong action, one unrepentant sin, one moment of weakness, and the result was anxiety. Not freedom, not peace that the evangelicals talk about, finding freedom in Jesus, have the peace of Christ that passes all understanding. Well, sorry, it didn't work for me. No, what ended up happening, instead of peace and joy as they talked about, it was clinical anxiety. And when anxiety becomes spiritualized, it can become very difficult to recognize because fear starts masquerading as faithfulness. I just decided to chuck all that because it was unhealthy and to assert my autonomy and live honestly, apart from any evangelical shackles. Part 4, hypervigilance in the name of faith. In a book called When Religion Hurts You, Dr. Laura Anderson repeatedly discusses how high control religious environments can shape a person's nervous system around fear, threat detection, and self-distrust, particularly through teachings including hell, purity culture, authoritarian leadership, such as we definitely find in evangelical Christianity, particularly in the MAGA movement, and the chronic fear of being wrong. The book description specifically notes that these elements can cause psychological, relational, physical, and spiritual damage. Further, Dr. Anderson discusses religious abuse, adverse religious experiences, the nervous system, and how people often experience a body's trauma response after growing up in a high control religion. This book really hit home for me, and I would highly recommend this book to anyone who has been through religious trauma. Let this info be part of the value that you find in this video, because this book made a world of difference in helping me put names to the faces of the things that I knew I was going through and yet didn't understand what they were. Many people raised in highly scrupulous religious environments, such as I was, describe becoming hypervigilant. So this isn't just isolated to me. No, this is a real thing that happens with people, or has happened with many people who have come out of evangelical Christianity or other high control religious environments. They learn to constantly monitor their thoughts, their emotions, their desires, motives, and even bodily reactions for signs of sin, deception, rebellion, or spiritual danger. So you better watch that erection if you're looking at some woman that you're not married to, or if you're looking at some man that you're not married to, because according to the Bible, that might be sinful, you see. Now, over time, that can create a relationship with oneself that is not only psychologically unhealthy, but it's based more on suspicion than trust. In the end, that's so unhealthy on multiple metrics. There's a difference between trusting yourself blindly and learning to trust yourself honestly. I'm not talking about just let it all hang out and be irrational or harm your neighbor or yourself in the process. I'm talking about responsible autonomy that promotes human flourishing for not only yourself, but for everybody involved. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. I am for learning how to trust myself honestly. And this means simply coming to the place where you can say, no, my experience matters. My conscience matters. My emotions contain information for me that I should listen to. My intuition deserves consideration and not to be erased or squelched. And I can question myself without despising myself. And I deserve to be happy and to live authentically. See, those two are completely different ideas. Part 5, the cross and the questions that wouldn't leave me alone. One question kept returning about penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA. Now, this is pretty much the stock evangelical doctrine, okay? Non-negotiable. It's part of the gospel, according to them. Well, see, I was taught that God requires us to forgive unconditionally. 70 times 7, as Jesus told Peter, right? To love our enemies, to show mercy, to practice grace. Yet I was also taught that God himself could not simply forgive humanity as he commanded and required us to do. It never made sense to me, but you just keep drinking the Kool-Aid, live with the cognitive dissonance of things that don't make sense, mind screw yourself into believing, well, one day it'll make sense because his thoughts and ways are higher than mine, and so blah-de-blah-de-blah. And so you just continue with the cognitive dissonance. Well, see, I finally just started really questioning that doctrine and how that might have factored in to the hypervigilance and the other religious trauma that I had undergone. So God could not simply forgive. His justice required the death and the murder or the bloodshedding of his son, Jesus. Now, why? Why is that? Well, for years, like I said, I accepted that explanation. I was told it was the orthodox position, To reject that meant you were rejecting the gospel itself. Now, if anything, that spurred me to ask further questions. Says who that it's the orthodox position? I discovered that many early Christians understood the cross in a completely different way. You see, many early Christians understood the cross as primarily God's victory over sin, death, and evil. Now, the idea that Jesus mainly died to absorb God's wrath as punishment for our sins became especially influential much, much later. Now, whether one agrees with PSA or not, history shows it is only one atonement theory among several, and not the only way that faithful Christians have understood the cross. Around 1100 CE, Anselm's satisfaction theory took root, and this says that God is not primarily punishing Jesus. Through the cross, Christ's divine honor is restored. Then during the Reformation era, that's when PSA, or the penal substitutionary atonement, became prominent. And the reformers, especially Martin Luther and John Calvin, They began emphasizing something different in the cross. Humanity deserves punishment. God's justice requires punishment, and that Jesus receives that punishment deserved by sinners, by guilty sinners who were born guilty as babies, remember. Now, where did they get all this from? From their time in history, their culture, and their renegotiations of the biblical text in order to suit their doctrinal needs at the time. In truth, that's how all Christians interpreted the Bible, to one degree or another. Whereas for 1,500 years prior, Christians had not understood PSA as the non-negotiable Orthodox view. Now, many progressive Christians, Eastern Orthodox, and some Catholics object because they feel that PSA can portray God needing violence before forgiveness, requiring punishment before mercy, or punishing an innocent person instead of the guilty. That's why they often prefer the Christus Victor or the moral example theories of the atonement. Now, growing up, I was taught one way, that Jesus died to absorb God's wrath against my sin because God needed someone to punish, since I was born so bad and so guilty. To believe anything else, as I was taught, was heresy. God could not accept me as I was, but could only look at me or stand to look at me through Jesus. Otherwise, I deserved nothing but eternal hell and misery. Now, do you understand how damaging that can be to tell a child that? Well, that's what I was told since 10 years old. Now, today, I would regard that as psychological abuse of children. Take a picture. Behold, your son. PSA doesn't work for me because I experienced it as a toxic, trauma-inducing teaching. And I discovered that it's not necessary to believe in penal substitutionary atonement in order to be a Christian. Now, what difference does PSA really make to this discussion? I'm glad you asked. In some religious environments, PSA can actually reinforce a framework of self-distrust and chronic self-suspicion. If you are repeatedly taught your heart is deceitful, your desires are corrupt, your instincts are fallen, you deserve God's wrath. Jesus had to die because of how sinful you are. And your greatest problem is your own wickedness coming from your own heart. You see? Then it's not hard to see how some folks might internalize that and say, I am fundamentally unsafe to trust. My inner world is inherently dangerous. That's a very different message. Asking those questions became a critical part of reclaiming my autonomy. Part 6, learning to trust myself again. Now, one of the hardest parts of deconstruction wasn't so much letting go of doctrines as it was learning to trust myself again. Trusting my conscience, trusting my empathy, trusting my capacity for reason, trusting my ability to evaluate evidence in a rational way, trusting my emotional experiences, trusting my humanity, my identity, who God made me to be. Now, not because I'm perfect, not because I'm infallible. It's because healthy people are not supposed to outsource their entire identity to external authorities. You see, we grow through reflection, through dialogue, through curiosity, through experience, through progress, and sometimes through changing our minds. And you know, that's okay with God. You see, the ability to change our minds is actually a sign of intellectual maturity. It's a healthy sign of a functioning conscience. Part 7, rethinking Jeremiah 17:9. Again, growing up, I was taught that Jeremiah 17:9 was ironclad evidence that I can't trust myself. Nothing. Now, if there was a disagreement between what I felt and what the authority figures told me, then, of course, I was taught that I was the problem and that maybe I just need a little more time with Jesus or a little more prayer or a little more Bible study. Because after all, the heart is deceitful above all things. You can't trust yourself now. You know, but as I got older, I started noticing something, that the same Bible that tells me that my heart can be deceived also tells me to love God and my neighbor with all my heart. So God tells me that I can love myself and my neighbor. He wouldn't tell me to do something that I can't do. It talks about recognizing truth by its fruits. So maybe Jeremiah wasn't teaching self-distrust or mistrust after all. Maybe Jeremiah wasn't teaching self-hatred. Maybe he was teaching against self-deception. And those are not the same thing. See, I don't believe any longer that I'm some kind of depraved worm or wiggling maggot deserving of hell because of my human nature. If Jeremiah 17:9 means that humans can't trust their own hearts, then how did anyone become a Christian in the first place? They trusted their conviction. They trusted their experience of God. They trusted their sense that the gospel is true. You see, at some point, everybody is trusting inner experience, whether we want to admit it or not. You see, the question isn't whether we trust ourselves. The question is, which parts of ourselves do we trust and how do we test them? That means weighing ancient religious texts alongside reason, evidence, lived experience, compassion, and what actually promotes human flourishing, even if that conflicts with an ancient interpretation. You see, the opposite of self-deception is not self-rejection. Yet many of us were taught a version of faith, or rather I would say a perversion of faith, that blurred those two together. You see, we learned to confuse humility with self-distrust. That mindset produced anxiety, shame, people-pleasing, religious trauma, and an inability to recognize their own needs, boundaries, sexuality, intuition, or conscience. I know it did for me. So I no longer believe that Jeremiah 17:9 requires me to fear myself. I think it invites humility about myself, and those are very different things. I decided to no longer let myself be gaslit by believing the problem must be me, rather than my former religion's indoctrinations. In closing, I did not leave evangelical Christianity because I wanted fewer rules. No, I left because I could no longer reconcile a faith that taught me to love my neighbor while simultaneously teaching me to fear myself. That's not self-love. Today, I still value compassion. I still value humility. I still value wonder, and I still value nature. I see God in nature every day. But I no longer believe that those things require self-condemnation. Okay? In fact, I'm still in therapy and recovery today, largely because of following the dogmas of evangelical Christianity. I know that I'm not alone in that regard. I talk weekly with people at my church and online who have been through similar experiences in religious trauma. So for me, healing started when I stopped asking, what's wrong with me? And rather started asking, what if I was never broken in the first place? You see, the opposite of faith is not doubt. Many times it's fear. Many times it's your religion. Many times the call could be coming from inside the house. I found that any faith or religion that discourages you from trusting your autonomy and insists that you should always mistrust yourself, keeping yourself under constant suspicion, is a faith or religion not worth having. And in fact, it is toxic and trauma-inducing. Deconstruction taught me how to better examine myself. I don't trust myself blindly. I trust evidence. I trust compassion. I trust reason. I trust experience. Yes, I trust my own conscience enough to let it have a seat at the table. So if you have found that this video has resonated with you, feel free to like or subscribe below. And you can see all my other links pointing you to my new album, Proud Heretic, released last month, as well as my merch line on Direct App. Thank you once again so much for your time and attention to this episode of Deconstruction Diaries. And we'll see you next time. Peace.